Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand on behalf of the Greens to speak on the Westpac New Zealand bill, a private bill come before this House, taking House time, quite a lot of public money. Mr Speaker, the Greens will be supporting this bill to Select Committee, but we won't be necessarily supporting it further until we have a look at it at Select Committee. Westpac is, of course, one of the oligopoly players in the New Zealand banking system. One of the things that became very clear during the banking inquiry is that we don't have a very competitive banking market, aside from KiwiBank in New Zealand, because we have the four pillars of the Australian banking system are, of course, present in New Zealand. And they've got a cosy arrangement. At least before KiwiBank turned up, they had a very cosy arrangement whereby they didn't compete on price. The market was divided up and they sought to maximise their profits that they sent back to Australia rather than competing on price. This was in some of the evidence that was presented to us by KiwiBank at the inquiry. And so those who don't really understand the banking sector, which I suspect is a lot of the National Party, they don't realise that in fact the way the banking sector works is that the banking sector was a cosy arrangement between the big Australian banks and that there wasn't any serious competition on price. And this is one of the problems we have in dealing with it. Of course, having basically let the banking sector slip into overseas ownership, we have this ongoing problem. We also have an issue with Westpac and the big Australian banks for their tax avoidance activities. On December 23rd last year, the big Australian banks were forced to pay back nearly $2 billion to the New Zealand taxpayer, $2 billion in taxes that they had unlawfully avoided and were caught out by the IRD and lost the cases in the New Zealand High Court. They fought them as far as they could. And then on December 23rd, which for those of you who don't know is 2 days before Christmas, when most people are rather busy doing other things, the announcement was made that the banks had agreed to pay back the money, or at least some of it. They didn't pay back all the money they owed, and they didn't have any penalties, unlike ordinary taxpayers, and no one from Westpac or anyone else was charged with anything. But nonetheless, they did agree to pay back a good chunk of the money that they had unlawfully avoided. So we're pretty cynical about the behaviour of Westpac and the other banks, having seen their behaviour in actively and unlawfully avoiding very, very large amounts of tax that they owed the New Zealand taxpayers. So, we have a slightly cynical approach to Westpac. We also have the problem, of course, because we have these they're foreign-owned banks, is that there's huge amounts of profits get transferred back. Part of New Zealand's current account deficit, the biggest part of it, is in the investment income deficit, and that's because of the profits that are going back to the overseas owners, the largely Australian-based overseas owners, which adds significantly to the current account deficit of New Zealand. In fact, in the middle of the global financial crisis, the Australian banks were transferring more money out of New Zealand than they were actually making in profits. It's one of the kind of untold stories of the GFC was that while we were subsidising effectively the banks by providing a wholesale and retail guarantee for them, they were shoveling money back across to their owners as fast as they could to make sure that the balance sheets back in Australia looked good. So while the New Zealand taxpayers were subsidising the banks because basically we gave them cheap insurance, and they would have been in trouble had the taxpayers not basically provided a wholesale and retail guarantee. At the same time, the banks were shoveling money back to their owners and providing a real problem for New Zealand because during the GFC, capital was extremely short, and so having the banks send the money back to Australia was a big problem. We've also got the issue with Westpac and the other banks around the treatment of staff. Basically, Westpac and other banks incentivise their staff to put people into debt. So they have staff incentives that you get paid bonuses if you can convince people to add more money on their credit card or to increase the credit card limit, which actually just creates further debt problems for New Zealanders. The other issue specific to Westpac is around the Master Banking Agreement. The last time the Master Banking Agreement was actually put out for open tender was when David Lange was Prime Minister, and we haven't had an open tender of that agreement since then. There have been some negotiations with Westpac, but it's very difficult for us to be sure that we're getting a very good deal out of Westpac when there has been no open tender agreement. Finally, of course, there is the issue of the pay. The CEO of Westpac's given $5 million a year out of the pockets of Westpac customers who ultimately have to pay that $5 million a year. I think it is grossly inequitable that we have someone in New Zealand who's paid $5 million a year. And I think that Westpac should look at itself and see, is that the kind of society we really want to live in?